My cheating wife went into despair when she saw what was written in the letter I sent her at work. Each word, carefully chosen, carried the weight of months of distrust, of sleepless nights, of empty looks at the dinner table. It was as if, at that moment, the floor of his perfect reality was crumbling before his eyes. She knew that betrayal had its price, but she never imagined it would be so high. I knew from the beginning. Little signs that others might ignore, I absorbed with surgical precision. A lost look, a forced smile, the way the phone was quickly put away when I entered the room. Nothing went unnoticed. Betrayal is not just the physical act, but the slow, almost imperceptible distancing that tears apart trust like a knife that cuts fragile silk. I felt this knife pierce my chest before I even had the evidence. It was on an ordinary afternoon, while she was at work, that I decided to take action. I let the poison of doubt flow inside me for too long. I needed something definitive. Something that would let her know that I knew, and that there was no going back. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote the letter. A confession of everything I had discovered, accompanied by evidence so devastating it could not be denied. The letter was not written to provoke a conversation, it was a final point. A cruel ending for the theater she staged so skillfully. I delivered the letter to the delivery service at her work, with clear instructions that it should be delivered directly to her desk, in the middle of the day. She would open it there, in front of everyone. It would be the first time that I would see, on paper, the reflection of what I had done. And what she saw, what she read, was more than just words. It was a sentence. I imagined what his reaction would be like. Perhaps silent tears ran down his face. Maybe panic got the better of her and she needed to leave the office immediately. But none of that really mattered to me. The damage was done. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. But why did I do this? Why did I choose such a public, humiliating confrontation? Because the silence that surrounded us inside the house was already consuming me. I needed to break this cycle of lies. Every night by his side in bed was torture. The smell of her perfume, which I once adored, now disgusted me. Every sweet word that came out of his mouth sounded false to me, as if it were rehearsed. I was no longer her husband, it was just a secondary part in the drama she lived with another. As I wrote the letter, scenes from our life together flashed through my head. The beginning, so promising. The plans, the dreams, the promises. Everything fell apart. With each word that appeared on the paper, I felt a pang of relief, as if I was finally regaining control of my own life. But there was also a bitter taste of revenge. I knew the letter would destroy her. And somehow, I wanted that. I wanted her to feel even a fraction of the pain she caused me. The letter was not long. It didn't need to be. All it took was a well-written paragraph and solid proof, one that was impossible to deny. And I had this proof. Stored in the back of my mind, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. I knew exactly what would break her. And that's what I sent. As I imagine the scene in the office, I see her eyes widening as she opens the envelope. I see the hands shaking, the face pale. The people around you, your coworkers, will notice. There will be questions, curiosity. But no one will have the answers. Just her, alone, surrounded by silent witnesses to her shame. How would she explain? How would I justify what I was reading? The humiliation would be public. There was no escape. I wonder now, sitting in silence, if she has read it yet. If at that exact moment, as I stare into the emptiness of our room, she is feeling the same emptiness invade her soul. Has she realized that her life as she knew it is over? The sound from the phone next to you seems louder than usual. At any time, she can call. But I won't answer. Not now. She needs to understand the impact of what she did, she needs to feel the loneliness, the despair, just like I felt. The images of that fateful afternoon when I found the evidence of betrayal are still vivid in my mind. The muffled laughter, the furtive touching of hands, the intimacy that she reserved for me and that now belonged to someone else. Every detail was recorded, as if it were a movie I couldn't stop watching. And now, this film was about to reveal itself to her in ways she could never have imagined. I think about the future. What will come after everything is exposed? I don't know. But what I do know is that when she reads that letter, when the words tear through the paper and reach her heart, everything will change. She will never be able to look at me the same way again. Not even for herself. And that, perhaps, is the real punishment. Now, only one question remains. How will she react when she realizes that, in addition to being exposed, her life, the life she built based on lies, will crumble in front of everyone? This is the curiosity that remains. An unanswered question, at least, until the next chapter of this story. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support or encourage betrayal. All of the stories you will hear are fictional, created to show the devastating impact that betrayal can have on people's lives. Our goal is to explore the emotional and psychological consequences of this act, revealing how it can destroy trust, relationships, and entire lives. Now, get ready for an intense and shocking story. Sit down and listen carefully. The suffocating heat of the Texas afternoon seemed a reflection of the silent tension that hovered in the country house. Daniel and Sarah had been married for 12 years. The marriage that had begun with promises of eternal love and shared dreams had turned into something distant and painfully familiar. From the outside, the house was the perfect picture of tranquility and prosperity. The lush green fields stretched as far as the eye could see, with horses grazing slowly in the distance, and the sky, clear and blue, seemed endless. It was the ideal setting for a full life. But inside the house, the coldness was palpable, as if the walls were witness to everything that was unsaid. Sarah spent most of her time taking care of the house and the small garden she had planted when they moved. Always proud of the space they built together, she was dedicated to keeping every detail perfect. From the outside, she was the ideal wife, dedicated, attentive, always with a smile for her neighbors. But when the doors closed, the smile disappeared and his eyes revealed a contained sadness. His gestures, previously full of affection, were now automatic, almost mechanical. The spark that existed between her and Daniel seemed to have been extinguished a long time ago. Daniel, on the other hand, had immersed himself in work. The construction company he inherited from his father grew every year, and he dedicated his energy to the success of the business. But away from the eyes of his employees and the contracts he signed, the emptiness he felt at home was inescapable. Sometimes he would look at Sarah, searching her face for some trace of that woman he had fallen in love with years before, but what he found was a stranger, someone with whom he shared a life, but with whom he barely shared a sincere dialogue. Dinner that night, like many others, was marked by the sound of cutlery touching the plates and the uncomfortable silence that surrounded them. Sarah spoke little, limiting herself to trivial questions about Daniel's work, while he responded in monosyllables, without making an effort to prolong the conversation. The atmosphere between them was a painful contrast to the beginning of their relationship, when they spent hours talking about their plans for the future, the children they would have, the trips they would take. Now, any mention of the future seemed like a distant memory, something they both preferred to avoid. Routine seemed to be the only thing keeping the marriage going. Daniel would wake up early, go to the office and return at the end of the day, tired and overwhelmed. Sarah stayed at home, busying herself with household chores, shopping at the local market and going to the city center for small social engagements. In the eyes of outsiders, they were the perfect couple, living a peaceful life in their beautiful country house. But deep down, they both knew something was wrong. Something deeply wrong. Sometimes Sarah found herself thinking back to the early years of their marriage, when they were still young and in love. The long walks in the countryside, the impromptu candlelit dinners, the easy laugh that would come for any reason. It all seemed like a past life, something that had happened to someone else. Now, she felt suffocated by a routine that no longer brought her satisfaction, by a marriage that, although still intact in the eyes of the world, was crumbling inside. Daniel, in turn, avoided thinking too much about what had changed. It was easier to sink into work, concentrate on the company's demands and the goals to be achieved. But at night, when he lay next to Sarah, the silence between them was deafening. He knew that something needed to be done, that they needed to talk, but each attempt to get closer seemed to be another failure. The feeling of helplessness grew every day. That night, after another emotionless dinner, Daniel retired to the office he had set up upstairs. Sitting at the dark wooden table, he looked at the pile of papers in front of him, but couldn't concentrate on anything. He took out his cell phone, scrolled through old messages and stopped at a photo of Sarah, taken years ago, on a trip they took to Colorado. She was laughing, her hair flowing in the wind, her expression carefree and full of life. The contrast with the woman who now lived next door to him was painful. Sarah, in turn, collected the dishes from the table and went to the kitchen. The sound of water running in the sink was the only noise that filled the house. She scrubbed the dishes harder than necessary, as if the action could ease the tension she felt. When he finished, he turned off the kitchen lights and went into the living room. The plush couch looked inviting, but as she sat down, the weight of her emotions crushed her. He looked at the clock. It was after 10, and she knew Daniel would probably be at the office late, like he had been lately. He always used work as an excuse to avoid any kind of deeper conversation. The days went on like this, dragged by a routine that didn't bring joy to either of them. Loneliness was a constant presence, even when they were together. Sarah sometimes tried to rekindle some kind of connection, but any effort seemed in vain. Daniel always seemed distant, immersed in his own thoughts, and she, in turn, closed herself off even more, building invisible walls around herself. As the night progressed, the sound of the wind outside the house was the only thing that interrupted the silence. Sarah walked slowly up the stairs, stopping for a moment in front of Daniel's office door. She thought about knocking, starting some conversation, but decided against it. She went to the bedroom, lay down on the bed and closed her eyes, hoping that sleep would come quickly and take her away from that oppressive reality. Daniel, still in the office, finally turned off the computer and put away the papers. He knew that this was another night in which he wouldn't be able to sleep properly, tormented by thoughts that he didn't know how to organize. When he went downstairs, he turned off the lights in the house, locked the front door and went to the bedroom, where Sarah was already sleeping. He watched her for a few seconds, her breathing calm, her hair spread across the pillow. She was still beautiful, but something about her had changed, and he didn't know exactly what. He lay down next to him, without making a sound, and stared at the ceiling. The weight of the silence between them was unbearable, but no words could come out. He knew they were on the edge of an abyss, but he didn't know how to retreat. Maybe I didn't even want it anymore. As the clock on the bedside table ticked the time, Daniel allowed himself to imagine what it would be like if things were different. If only there was a way to get back what they had lost. But that was a fantasy he quickly discarded. He knew that on some level you two had already given up on each other. And so, another night passed. Another day would arrive, bringing with it the same routine. But beneath the surface, something was about to change, in ways they could not yet predict. In the days that followed, the distance between Daniel and Sarah seemed to grow even further, like an invisible abyss that slowly swallowed them. The silences became longer, the dialogue shorter and the exchange of glances increasingly rare. Daniel tried to concentrate on his work, but the nagging feeling that something was out of place haunted him. He could feel that there was something that wasn't right, something that Sarah was hiding, but every time he tried to confront that feeling, he convinced himself that maybe he was just paranoid. Sarah, on the other hand, became increasingly busy with her trips to the city. The local market, visits to the beauty salon, chance meetings with friends that now filled her schedule. But there was more to her escapades than she let on. Every time she left the house, she felt the weight of her own decisions. The smile she wore to everyone was a carefully constructed mask, while inside she found herself trapped in a conflict she herself had created. That week, an unexpected meeting at Daniel's office forced him to cancel a business trip to Dallas. He didn't mention the change of plans to Sarah. Maybe because he was distracted, or maybe because of something deeper, a part of him that wanted to observe what was happening in his absence. However, deep down, he knew it wasn't just distraction. His intuition told him that something important was about to happen. That morning, Sarah went out as usual, dressed in casual elegance, the light perfume she always wore. She said she was meeting some friends for coffee, and Daniel watched her walk out the door without commenting. As soon as the sound of tires disappeared on the dirt road, he felt an uneasiness take over his body. He decided to take the day off, something he rarely did. And instead of going to the office, he took his car and impulsively drove towards the city. The path was familiar, but this morning it felt different. The landscape he knew by heart, with the fields that stretched endlessly, now seemed the stage for something he still couldn't name. The speed at which his heart was beating was incompatible with the calm scenery around him. The feeling that something was about to be revealed consumed him. Arriving in the city, Daniel parked on one of the main streets and, without much thinking, went towards the cafe where Sarah said she would be. He walked in, looked around, and as expected, she wasn't there. No sign of her friends or any indication that she had passed by. His stomach turned, but he decided not to act hastily. Maybe she had changed her plans at the last minute. However, doubt now increasingly gnawed at his thoughts. And it was this doubt that led him to act in a way he had never done before. He returned to his car and, impulsively, called a friend who worked in private security in the city. Without revealing too much, he asked for a small favor, to locate Sarah's car. While waiting for a response, parked in a remote location, Daniel felt guilt mixed with fear. He had never been a suspicious man, and the idea of following his own wife seemed surreal. But the suspicions he had tried to bury for so long now came to life. A short time later, the phone vibrated. Daniel's friend had found Sarah's car parked in a residential neighborhood, a few blocks from where he was. Without thinking twice, Daniel drove to the location. The address took him to a quiet street, with simple houses and well-kept lawns. And there was her car, parked in front of a house with a discreet facade. He parked a little further ahead, far enough away not to be noticed, and stood there, watching. What would she be doing there? A visit to someone he didn't know? Maybe a friend I hadn't mentioned. But something about the scene didn't add up. Minutes passed, and Daniel decided to wait. After almost an hour, the door to the house opened. His heart stopped. Sarah left the house, but she was not alone. Beside her, a man. Tall, with a confident posture, he placed his hand on her back in an intimate manner. Daniel felt the air escape his lungs, as if the world had slowed down for an instant. The scene before his eyes was clear and undeniable. They exchanged glances, smiles he hadn't seen on his wife's face in a long time. Then the man kissed her, a gesture that seemed as natural as it was devastating. Daniel gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The betrayal, which until then was just a shadow of a doubt, was now in front of him, materialized. Every detail of that scene was recorded in his mind, the man's soft touch, the way Sarah tilted her head, as if this were an ordinary moment for both of them. He didn't know how long he stayed there, paralyzed, seeing the woman he promised to love forever involved with someone else. Emotions were mixed, anger, pain, disbelief. It was as if an avalanche had hit him, destroying all the certainties he had about his marriage. The silence inside the car contrasted with the chaos that was taking place inside it. Every fiber of his being wanted to get out of the car, confront her right there. But something held him back. Maybe it was the shock, or the need to process what I was seeing. Maybe it was the wounded pride, the pain that still couldn't find words to express. When Sarah and the man re-entered the house, Daniel started the car and drove off. He didn't know where he was going or what he would do next. The weight of betrayal was real now, and he felt as if everything around him was falling apart. The city streets, the family homes, everything seemed distant, as if he were seeing everything through a broken lens. As he drove aimlessly, a decision began to take shape in his mind. He wouldn't confront her right away. Not like that. Sarah still didn't know he found out. And that gave him an advantage he intended to use. What he would do next would be planned, calculated. The betrayal was exposed, but the true revelation was yet to come. Night was approaching, and with it, the beginning of a new phase. That night would be different. Daniel knew this from the moment Sarah entered the house, hours after leaving the man's house. He watched her silently, not saying a word, as she tried to act like everything was normal. She smiled, exchanged a few trivial words and went straight to the shower, as she always did. But for Daniel, nothing was the same. He no longer saw the woman he had known, that he had loved, but rather a stranger, someone who carried secrets that he had barely begun to understand. The hours passed in silence. Dinner was cold, not because of the temperature of the food, but because of the lack of any connection between them. Sarah, uncomfortable, picked at her food with her fork, while Daniel watched her. He had already decided what he would do that night, and the weight of the decision suffocated him. His chest burned, but his expression was contained, rigid. There would be no explosions. Not now. Everything would be calculated, as he had planned in the last few days. After dinner, Sarah went up to her room, as she always did. Daniel waited for the sound of the bedroom door to close, and then went to the office, where the letter was ready. He had written it carefully, measuring every word, aware that what was about to happen would change their lives forever. With the letter in hand, he felt a chill down his spine. It wasn't just a confession, it was a sentence. The clock was almost 10 when Daniel decided to go up. The silence that filled the house was dense, heavy, almost palpable. He opened the bedroom door slowly, without making any noise. Sarah was lying down, staring at the ceiling. There was something about her that night, a restlessness that Daniel noticed immediately. Maybe she also felt like something was about to explode. He walked to the bed, sat on the edge and, without saying a word, handed her the envelope. Sarah frowned, confused. He took the letter with trembling fingers, not knowing what to expect. When he opened the envelope, his heart began to race. She looked to Daniel for answers, but his face remained expressionless, almost cold. "What is that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but the tremor in her words betrayed her. "Read it," he replied, his voice low, almost a whisper, but filled with a gravity that Sarah couldn't ignore. She swallowed hard and looked down at the paper. At first, the words seemed confusing, jumbled together amidst the anxiety rising in his throat. But as the lines took shape, understanding came like a blow. His eyes widened, and his hands began to truly shake. The letter was much more than a revelation, it was a brutal exposure of everything she thought she had hidden. Each line described in detail how Daniel discovered her betrayal. Not just the trips to her lover's house, but the time he had spent gathering evidence, following her steps, watching her lie every time she said she was going to meet friends or that she needed to resolve something in the city center. He had discovered everything. "No," Sarah murmured, her voice coming out like a thread, weak and dazed. "Daniel, please." She tried to justify herself, but the words died in her mouth. "The terror I felt at that moment was unbearable. I knew there was no excuse, that there was no going back." Daniel remained silent, watching her struggle with her own feelings, the tears now welling in her eyes. "How could you do that?" Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice firm but still controlled. "After everything we've built, after all these years, how?" Sarah couldn't find the right words. Her mind was blank as the reality of what she had done began to crash in on her. Her hands gripped the letter paper tightly, as if at any moment they could tear it, but what was written there was already engraved in her mind. She tried to start, but Daniel interrupted her. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I've heard all the lies you had to tell." Daniel's voice, previously controlled, now revealed pain. It wasn't just anger, it was disappointment, a wound he knew would never heal. He got up, walked to the window and looked at the dark field outside. The silence between them was deafening, but the words he needed to say weren't finished yet. "I watched you for weeks," Daniel continued, without looking at her. "Every lie, every excuse, every time you left, and I knew exactly where you were going. But I wanted to wait. I wanted to see how far you would go, how long it would last before you yourself realized what you were doing." Sarah was sobbing softly now, unable to stop herself from crying. She had no words to defend herself, and Daniel didn't seem willing to listen to them. "And now you're going to tell me what I already know?" He turned to her, his eyes fixed on hers, penetrating. "That it was a mistake. What do you regret? That it didn't mean anything?" She shook her head, trying to speak, but the words were just an empty echo of apologies that meant nothing. She knew she was lost. "You have no idea what this pain is, Sarah. Knowing that the person with whom you shared your life, with whom you built everything, was leading another life, in the shadows." His voice trailed off for a moment, and Sarah felt the weight of guilt crushing her. "And you thought I would never know?" He thought he could continue with this without consequences. He approached, stopping in front of her. Sarah felt the air catch in her throat, unable to say or do anything. "But the worst of all," Daniel continued, his voice now firm again, "the worst of all wasn't the betrayal itself. It was your cowardice, your lack of respect for us. For our history." Sarah tried to move, but her legs felt stuck to the floor. She knew she had lost everything. Daniel looked at her one last time before walking away. "The letter was just the beginning, Sarah," he said, his voice low, but each word seemed to cut the air like a sharp blade. "There is much more you need to know." She looked at him, confused and terrified. What else could he have discovered? What else did he know? Daniel turned, walking slowly towards the door. "Tomorrow, at your work, you will understand what I'm talking about," he said, without looking back. And with those words, he left the room, leaving Sarah alone with the letter in her hands, her heart shattered and her mind boiling with fear and despair. She knew the real blow was yet to come. Sarah sat there, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the letter Daniel had given her. His heart was still beating fast, and his mind was in complete chaos. His words echoed in your head, especially the last sentence, "Tomorrow, at your job, you will understand what I'm talking about." What else could he have prepared? What was Daniel planning? Despair began to take over. She knew the worst was yet to come, but the feeling of being completely helpless left her breathless. He stood up slowly, his body heavy, as if each movement was a monumental effort. He walked around the room in circles, without direction, not knowing what to do. The already dry tears on her face were now giving way to a new wave of panic. Daniel knew about the betrayal, but what was he about to do? The fear of losing everything consumed her. The marriage that, although empty, still represented a solid foundation, the comfortable life he led, the carefully maintained appearances. This was all about to fall apart, and Sarah knew there was no escape. She tried to think of a solution, a way to contain the damage, but it all seemed futile. The betrayal was exposed, and now the secret that Daniel had hinted at hung over his head like a dark cloud about to collapse. Sarah walked down the stairs slowly, feeling the weight of emotions on each step. When he arrived at the living room, he found Daniel sitting in one of the leather armchairs, with a hard expression on his face, his eyes fixed on nothing. He didn't look at her when she entered. The silence was overwhelming. She wanted to speak, but didn't know what to say. How to justify the unjustifiable? How to explain betrayal? The words that came to his mind all seemed empty, meaningless. Finally, Sarah took courage and broke the silence. "What are you going to do, Daniel?" His voice was weak, almost inaudible, but he heard it. Daniel didn't move, but his voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. "You'll find out tomorrow, Sarah. No need to worry about trying to guess." She felt her stomach drop. Daniel's calm tone, full of control, was worse than any angry outburst. It was a sign that he had planned something meticulous, something that was beyond his control. She took a tentative step toward him, trying to find some form of reparation, some sign that there was still a chance to save what was left. But before he could say anything, Daniel raised his hand, signaling that he didn't want to hear it. "It's no use, Sarah," he said, his voice serious and definitive. "There is nothing you can say that will change what is about to happen." She stood there, looking at him, feeling helpless. His mind was made up, and nothing she said now would make a difference. The weight of the moment hit her with full force. The future she had built in her mind, even if it was based on lies and illusions, was crumbling before her eyes. Daniel got up, walked to the fireplace and leaned on the wooden frame, facing away from it. He seemed to be searching for the right words, as if what he was about to say required careful concentration. After a long moment of silence, he spoke, still facing away from Sarah. "Do you think you know me, Sarah? Do you think you know what I can do?" She didn't respond. He just waited, feeling that something bigger was coming. "I spent weeks," he continued, his voice now lower, almost a whisper, "weeks planning what to do with this information. I could have confronted you right away. I could have done what many do, scream, demand answers, and everything in the heat of the moment. But I decided to wait. I wanted to see how far you would go. How far would he be able to lie?" Daniel turned slowly, staring at her with an intensity that made her shrink. His eyes were filled with deep pain, but there was something more in them, an unbreakable determination. "Tomorrow," he said, approaching her, "you will understand what it's like to lose control over your own life. Tomorrow, everything you tried to hide will be exposed." Sarah felt like a prisoner on the verge of a final sentence. The air felt thin, difficult to breathe. She knew Daniel wasn't just talking the talk. He had something concrete in mind, something that would destroy more than just his marriage. "Daniel, please," she tried, her voice choked with terror and regret. "There's no point anymore, Sarah." He interrupted, without letting her finish. "You made your choices. Now you will deal with the consequences." The clock on the wall seemed to tick off each second with a louder sound than usual. Time, which before seemed to drag by, now ran too fast. Sarah tried to find a way to react, but the immensity of what was coming paralyzed her. Her mind was a whirlwind of fears and regrets, and all she could think about was how the life she knew was on the verge of being destroyed. She thought about asking for forgiveness, begging for a second chance, but deep down she knew it was already too late. There was no going back. Daniel stared at her with a mixture of coldness and pain, and she knew that what he did next would be final. "Brace yourself, Sarah," he said, his words firm and full of meaning. "Tomorrow, you will understand what betrayal really means." And with those words, he turned and left the room, walking towards the guest room, where he would spend the night. Sarah stood there, alone in the silence of the room, with the weight of her choices finally falling on her shoulders. There was nothing left to do but wait. The night passed slowly and tortuously. Sleep didn't come, and Sarah spent the next few hours tossing and turning in bed, trying to imagine what Daniel could have planned. Each possibility was worse than the last, and the fear of what would come the next day gnawed at her insides. When the first ray of sunlight broke through the bedroom curtains, Sarah knew that the decisive day had arrived. Dawn brought with it palpable tension. Sarah had barely slept. His thoughts were spinning endlessly, trying to find some relief or solution to what was coming. However, he knew that, regardless of any attempt, the end of his marriage was sealed. What she didn't know, and this was what terrified her, was what form this end would take. Daniel had already left the house before sunrise. He didn't say goodbye, he didn't make eye contact, He just left a dry note on the kitchen table with a simple sentence, "Today, everything changes." Sarah looked at the note with shaking hands, trying to decipher the real meaning of it, but the only thing she felt was the growing despair taking over her body. She knew that when she got to work, Daniel's letter, or whatever he had prepared, would be waiting for her. So, with her heart sinking and her mind in shambles, she mechanically got dressed and drove to the office. Each kilometer traveled felt heavier, as if the road was lengthening, prolonging his agony. When I arrived at work, the atmosphere seemed as normal as any other day. Her office colleagues smiled, the receptionist greeted her, and the sound of keyboards filled the room. But for Sarah, the internal chaos was uncontrollable. His breathing was shallow, his hands were sweating. Something was about to happen. She sat at the table, trying to maintain her composure, but the uncertainty of what came next consumed her. He looked at the clock, counting the minutes, when the silence was broken by the sound of the meeting room door opening. Sarah's boss appeared, calling her with a serious face. "Sarah, can you come to the meeting room?" he said, without the slightest trace of emotion. She nodded, feeling her stomach tighten. It was the moment. Inside the room, there was only one person besides the boss, Daniel. He was sitting, with a folder in front of him and a calm but impenetrable look. Sarah tried to hide the tremor in her hands as she entered. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. Daniel opened the folder and, without saying anything, slid several papers across the table towards him. They were photos. Photos of her and her lover. Sarah felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. There, before her, was the definitive proof of her betrayal, captured in intimate, irrefutable moments. She froze, unable to look up. "I warned you that today everything would change," said Daniel, his voice firm, but without raising the tone. "And here it is." Sarah could barely breathe. It wasn't just the shame of the photos themselves, but the fact that they were being displayed there, in his work environment, in front of his boss. "These photos," Daniel continued, interrupting his thoughts. "They were sent to the entire company board. Every member knows what you did. And more than that, all your co-workers already have a copy of these images." Horror gripped Sarah. She tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't respond. The boss, who remained silent, left the room, without looking at her, leaving her alone with Daniel. The silence was suffocating, and the enormity of what had happened hit her hard. "I wanted you to know, Sarah, that I didn't do this out of revenge," Daniel said, his voice now filled with a frightening coldness. "I did this to make sure you understand what it is to destroy a life. Not just mine, but yours too." The tears she had been trying to hold back now flowed freely down her face. She was exposed. His personal life, his marriage, and now his career were ruined. Sarah tried to speak, to ask for forgiveness, to beg for some form of repair, but the words wouldn't come. She knew there was nothing more she could say or do. "You destroyed our life," Daniel continued, his voice still low, but full of intensity. "And now, you will deal with the consequences." He got up, walked to the door, but before leaving, he turned around one last time. "We are officially divorced. The paperwork was handed over to his lawyer this morning. Enjoy your new life, Sarah. From now on, everything will be different." And with those words, he left her alone in the room. Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of pain and regret. She could barely process what had just happened. His betrayal had not only ruined her marriage, but everything she had built. The public humiliation, the destruction of her reputation. It was all more than she could bear. Sarah remained there, frozen, unable to move or react. His world, which until days ago seemed solid, was now in ruins. She had made her choices, and now she would have to live with them forever. Daniel, on the other hand, left that room with a mixture of relief and emptiness. He had done what he thought was necessary, but the feeling of victory was not there. What was left now was a painful silence, a void that nothing seemed to fill. He knew life would move on, but the scar from that shattered marriage would remain. His revenge had been accomplished, but what came after that was still uncertain. As he drove away from the office, Daniel glanced at the horizon. He didn't feel happiness, just the feeling that that chapter of his life had ended, and that now he would have to build something new. Something far from Sarah, far from the lies and betrayals. But he knew deep down that he would always remember that day. From the day his life turned upside down and he was forced to reinvent himself. It was the beginning of a new phase, but the weight of memories would accompany him for a long time. And so ends another story. Betrayal does not bring victories, only destruction on all sides. Comment below what you thought of this story and share your opinion. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, we do not support any type of cheating here. These stories are fictional, and our goal is to show how betrayal can destroy lives. Until next time.